Hello everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at how we can manage capacity. So this presupposes two things: that we've developed an understanding of the capacity measurements within our operation, so how we're measuring capacity. It presupposes that we also have an understanding of the seasonality present within the market, and we're able to relatively accurately forecast demand, i.e. we've identified our predictable variations in demand, and therefore can start with the task of trying to reconcile capacity and demand. And that's what we're going to be looking at for the rest of this video, are different tools to reconcile capacity and demand. So the blue line here identifies our forecasted demand. You're never going to be precisely accurate with your forecasted demand, but the more data you have, the more accurate your models are, the better your understanding of the causes of seasonality and therefore the root causes of your predictable cycles of demand. All of that's going to result in better and more accurate forecasted demand. And the red line is your estimation of your current capacity. So we also have a appropriate measurement of capacity, and we have an accurate count of our present capacity within the operation. So we've got two different measurements here: forecasted demand and current capacity, and what we need to do is to try and reconcile them as closely as possible. The thing to remember is that unused capacity is dangerous, because unused capacity costs money. Either costs money directly, if you have a warehouse full of goods, then you have to pay for that storage, in terms of heating, in terms of security, so that all is a constant cost, as well as representing opportunity cost. You could be doing something else with that capacity. You could be doing something else with those resources, and with those materials that you may need to maintain capacity. At the same time, we don't want to have capacity lagging behind demand, because if you have too little capacity, you're essentially turning away revenue. You're turning away potential customers, and that's something which organizations want to avoid as well. So we want to get it as close to our forecasted demand as possible, but we have three different major approaches to doing so. And these are very, very contextually dependent. There is no significant advantage of one approach over another. It depends on your industry, the type of organization you are, the position you occupy in the marketplace, as well as your exact goods and services that you're offering. And it also depends on the kind of strategy you're following. So remember that the role of operations in relation to strategy does differ on how developed the operations function is. So that plays a key role as well. So two companies in the exact same industry dealing with the exact same types of products, and the same marketplace, may have different approaches to reconciling capacity and demand, depending on the maturity of their operations function and its relation to the overall strategic objectives of the organization. So if we start with the first, which is level capacity. So with this approach to capacity management, what we're doing is, irrespective of the cycle of demand, so the variation in demand, we're going to maintain level capacity. And this may be for a couple of different reasons. It may be that capacity is very difficult to shift. So if you're dealing with capacity measurements that depend on large part on big capital investments, then it may be very difficult for you to increase or decrease capacity easily. So if your capacity depends on specialist machinery, if you have an automated robotic production line, for example, that is a large capital investment to get it set up and running. So it may not be particularly easy to increase or decrease that capacity. So we want to try and keep capacity level, and there are a couple of ways we can do to try and make it as efficient as possible. So firstly would be warehousing. is just accept the fact that we're going to have excess capacity at key points, but at other points you may have insufficient capacity. So if we warehouse our excess capacity and then we're able to use it in times where our production is not keeping up with demand. So it could be for 6 months out of the year you're producing shoes, and you're producing more shoes than you're actually selling, but you're warehousing them, so you're storing your excess capacity. And then in the other 6 months of the year you're actually producing less than you need, so your production hasn't shifted, you're still producing the same number of shoes, but the cycles of demand mean that in the latter half of the year demand is outstripping supply. Demand is outstripping your capacity to manufacture, but you have warehoused capacity. So that works well if you have a very predictable cycle of demand. Otherwise, you run the risk of having produced excess, and therefore not being able to recoup any revenue on the excess you've produced. And instead, you have to eat the cost of production. It also doesn't work with services. So having this approach of having level capacity and storing your excess capacity only works if it can be stored. So if you're producing shoes, for example, that's absolutely fine. You can produce 15 shoes and you only sell 10 shoes a day. The extra 5 shoes can be stored in a warehouse, and as long as the warehouse is properly maintained, they'll be suitable to be sold in a year's time or 6 months' time. Services cannot be stored, however. So if you have 5 hairdressers, so you're able to offer 5 haircuts, say every hour, but you only have 3 customers, the next hour you can't offer 7 haircuts because you didn't offer 2 haircuts in the previous hour. You are still only going to be able to offer 5 haircuts an hour. You're only going to be able to serve 5 customers per hour, regardless of how much excess capacity you have over the course of however many hours. So services don't benefit from this approach because services cannot be stored. But if you can store your capacity, so if you can store your products, you can keep level capacity and store the excess. So that's having the approach of deliberately producing excess in order to store. The second approach is making to stock. This is a similar motivation really for pursuing this approach of level capacity. You're making to store goods, but also we see some interesting variations. So part producing is a major one. So producing the first element of the production line. So if you're producing a good which requires say 4 different stages, actually going through the first 2 stages and then storing to complete the production later is quite a common variation where it does yield some kind of operational advantage, or indeed makes the item easier to store or more viable to store as well. And lastly, making customers wait is one other useful way of understanding this approach of level capacity. So we said that you cannot store haircuts, so you can't store a service is delivered at the same time that it's produced, unlike a good which is produced separately from when it's delivered. However, you can in a service store customers. So while a hairdresser is not going to be able to deliver more haircuts than they have hairdressers, they can't store excess capacity. They can establish a queuing system or establish an appointment system and redistribute the actual customers themselves. So implementing a queuing system, turning people away with the anticipation that they'll wait and come back later is one way of maintaining level capacity that we see in various services around us fairly frequently, as well as with products. So if you're determined to maintain level capacity and the majority of your time you're actually underproducing relative to demand, if you're confident that your customers will wait to purchase your good when demand generally falls below capacity, That again is one way of maintaining the capacity the way that it is presently. So if we move to the second mechanism of reconciling capacity and demand, that would be chasing demand. In this approach, we are going to change our capacity within the operation in order to try and match demand. So as demand rises, we're going to increase our capacity, and as demand falls, we're going to decrease our capacity. So this does require us to have the ability to change capacity without major negative impacts. So if you have high capital investment, that may be difficult to do, but if you have low capital investment, or quite commonly you have a large proportion of your capacity depends on labor, then that becomes far more feasible to actually implement. So two of our associated means for chasing demand are going to be labor based. So the first will be temporary labor. So if you're running, let's say, a manufacturing plant which is heavily dependent upon labor, you can simply hire temporary staff when you expect demand to be high. So therefore you can increase your output because you have additional temporary staff on hand. And then as the contracts run out, your demand falls according to its predictable cycle, and your capacity would be reduced as well. This would be listed as temporary labor because in the majority of, or rather not the majority at all, but in many economies, hiring and firing people, i.e. making someone redundant, so they've lost their job through no fault of their own, but because their job doesn't exist anymore, there's no more need for them, only works with long-term changes. In the UK, for example, or anywhere in the EU, if you hire people on permanent positions, only then to make them redundant when there's a predictable downturn of demand, and you want to then hire new people in 5 months when you have an upturn in demand, that would breach labor regulations. You're not able to actually make people redundant based upon a predictable cycle of demand. However, if they are temporary staff, that's very different. Then they're coming on a contractual basis on the understanding that they have a 3-month contract or a 5-month contract or even a 2-week contract. And then they're able to plug the gaps in a way that allows you to easily increase and decrease capacity. But we can also change our labor value in capacity without needing to actually bring in new staff members. So this would be the use of overtime and short time. So overtime is fairly straightforward. If you have a number of people, staff members contracted for say 8 hours a day, and then you have an increase in demand during a set period, you can simply pay people more to work 10 hours or 12 hours or 14 hours a day. Again, this is usually heavily regulated, so within the EU there is limitations on how much overtime someone can do, but also on compelling employees to work overtime. So if they have an employment contract which specifies 8 hours a day, then there's a limited amount you can do as an employer to insist or force your employees to work 10 or 12 hours a day for a set period. However, being able to pay them time and a half or double rate tends to be quite a universal incentive, so you're able to then increase your capacity in that mechanism. Short time is pretty much the reverse of this. So short time is particularly common where an environment is heavily unionized, and is where everyone takes a reduction in hours to avoid any layoffs or redundancies. So if you have overtime being paid when capacity is high, when capacity dips, there could be an agreement that everyone is now going to work 6 hours a day to avoid anyone being made redundant or laid off. It works quite well, particularly in union environments, because you need everyone to agree to this. Otherwise, it's simply not a feasible option. But if you're able to use overtime and short time, then you're able to increase and decrease capacity to match demand without needing to actually go and get temporary labor. Both of those examples depended upon labor being either the primary or one of the important factors when it comes to changing the capacity of your operation. However, even if you don't rely upon labor, or labor isn't the primary determinant of your capacity, you still have a means to chase demand, which is outsourcing. So here you would actually outsource a key part of your capacity as an operation to a third party, with an agreement that capacity would increase at certain periods and decrease at other periods. And this would relieve you as an operations manager or an organization from having to absorb the costs of rapidly changing capacity. An example of this, actually one which you may be familiar with, is simply security at the university. So there is a predictable cycle of demand when it comes to security services on campus, and that just basically tracks the number of students. So during term time, particularly semester 1 and semester 2, where we have a high number of students on campus, the demand for security services increases, but then in the inter-semester breaks, in the reading weeks, in the winter and Easter holidays, as well as in the quieter third semester, we have a significant drop in demand for security services. Now, the university could either actually go ahead and hire temporary labor or pay overtime, but then they have to manage that change in capacity. But what they've actually done is outsource the security function altogether to Securitas. So they simply have an agreement with Securitas over the number of security guards which are going to be available, and therefore Securitas will increase and decrease capacity. Now, you might think that is still temporary labor, but there is a significant difference in that if you're outsourcing to a specialist third party, they will manage their capacity in a different manner. So Securitas deal with security guards, it's their business, they're a security outsourcing company, so they may or they likely will be able to shuffle around their resources to use staff on a variety of different roles across different clients, so they may not necessarily be hiring and firing people to match your capacity. They could just be shuffling their own internal resources around. But from your perspective as the outsourcer, as the organization that's managing capacity, you see your capacity rise and fall to try and chase a demand or match the demand as much as possible. And that brings us to our third approach to reconciling capacity and demand. So with the first, with level capacity, we're storing either capacity, products, or storing customers. With chasing demand, we're rapidly adapting our capacity. We're increasing and decreasing capacity to try and keep up or match demand. The third one is actually leaving capacity altogether and focusing on the demand. So we're actually managing the demand to try and bring it closer to our capacity rather than trying to change our capacity to match demand. This is particularly useful if you're unable to do either of the previous two approaches. So if you're unable to maintain excess capacity and you're unable to rapidly change capacity, so you're only able to maintain the same level of capacity, and it will be too costly for you to either chase demand or to capture your excess capacity, then demand management may well be the only practical solution. It also functions as a useful secondary approach to capacity management as well, something that can be done alongside either of the previous two approaches. So there's quite a few different ways that we can actually manage demand. So sales and promotion is the most obvious one. With sales and promotions, we can increase demand during quiet periods, and also conversely, if we remove the sales and we remove the promotions, we can decrease demand during busy periods. Great example of this would be cinemas. I don't know why I'm choosing cinemas when it seems fairly likely that cinemas may never recover after coronavirus, but nonetheless, at this point, we're all still familiar with how cinemas work. Very few people go to the cinema during matinee showings anymore. So showings in the early afternoon, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they tend to be very quiet periods, and you'll find that you can actually purchase a cinema ticket relatively cheaply during those periods. So that would really stimulate demand. To a degree, it would stimulate demand. So if you're looking to go to the cinema and watch a film, and you're able to purchase a ticket for £1 or £2, that is going to naturally incentivize you to go during that time period. Similarly, you'll also see that promotions tend to be quite common during traditionally quiet periods. So whether it's restaurants offering promotions during Monday to Wednesday, which are traditionally the quietest periods to go and eat out in a restaurant, again, that would very much be aimed at stimulating demand. Or cheap flights during winter months to traditionally summer destinations. So you may be able to get a very cheap flight when demand itself is traditionally low, and the ticket prices during the summer months to the same destination may be triple or multiples of the price during the winter months. So that will stimulate demand as well as cap demand when demand is naturally quite high. The other method, making customers wait, is a method of demand management as well, depending on your brand loyalty and the nature of the product and service and the nature of your relationship with customers. By making customers wait, just like as we saw previously in the level capacity approach, you're able to shift demand from high periods to lower periods. So if your offering is that compelling and you have your offering in a set manner, you could essentially flatten the peaks of demand by forcing customers to seek your offering when it suits your capacity, when it suits your operation, rather than the natural demand driven by one of the 6 sources of demand fluctuation we examined in the previous video. And lastly, we have the option of developing alternative offerings within our operation to try and develop new sources of demand for our operation. So we're using existing resources to satisfy a new cycle of demand, and ideally that cycle of demand will be the inverse of the previous cycle of demand. So if we consider a factory which is producing winter shoes, again, I'm not sure why I'm fixated on shoes during the recording of this video, but that's the example that comes to mind. So you're producing winter shoes, so demand, it tends to be very high during the winter months, but then those resources are underutilized during the summer months, where demand for winter shoes is massively reduced. Now, an alternative offering could be beach sandals or summer shoes. So you can use your existing operational resources by serving a different offering to the marketplace and therefore leveling out demand ideally, or at least managing demand to the point that your capacity is as close as possible to meeting that demand. So by developing these kinds of alternative offerings, we're able to use our internal resources in a more efficient, effective way, and that itself will manage the demand to bring it in line with our overall capacity.